Oh, is that your computer telling us that we're live?
We are live.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we are back for, is this week 3? Yes. Yes, this is our 3rd week.
This is our 3rd week.
Yeah, so welcome to the Stand to Reason book club. My name's Alan. You can see John and Tim also. We are your hosts. Tim, your mic is muted. Do you know that?
I did. I just
that was on purpose.
Yeah, I did that on purpose. I was trying to be incognito here, and you blew my cover.
Okay, sorry.
I had a stampede of kids running down the hall, and I'm like, uh-oh.
He's doing another live broadcast concurrently.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're coming to you from 2 different countries. Wow, this is like an international book club. So we got
United Nations.
Yeah, John and I are in California, United States of America, and Tim's
just like another country too.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, think about it. So Canada has a population of what, like just under 40 million. California all by itself has the same population.
Wow.
So
Canada, the 51st state.
That's a great, interesting fact.
It's unbelievable. Yeah, John's got the logic. Okay, anyways, enough of that. Let's jump into why we are here, because we're here to talk about our book, Universe Next Door, which we are all reading together. And we are in chapter, is that 5, 4? I should know.
Chapter 4.
Yeah, chapter 4, naturalism. So 2 weeks ago, we covered the subject of naturalism, the worldview of naturalism. And if you recall, or if you joined us then, we didn't really finish the chapter. We left the section on Marxism alone because we wanted to dedicate an entire episode, which is today's episode, to Marxism, which is what we're going to be covering today, and the related subject of critical theory, or contemporary critical theory, which we'll do a good job of defining, I'm sure, at some point. And as we've mentioned before, we're not really trying to teach through this book. We're just kind of all reading it together and then just kind of giving our insights, things that we like, things that we didn't like, things that we thought were clear or not clear, or just insights into the book. So just so you know, we're not really teaching the content per se, although hopefully there'll be some benefit that comes from what we share. Although it's not guaranteed. Anyways, I just wanted to say before we begin that I think this chapter, the chapter on naturalism and specifically on Marxism, I think it really highlights one of the reasons why we chose this book. And it's because we believe this book, which is about worldviews, that worldviews are like a key tool for helping to understand ideas and for understanding our culture. And so with regards to specifically Marxism and naturalism, which is the broader worldview that Marxism falls under, right now in our culture, we're seeing all kinds of ideas being played out, right? Cancel culture, white privilege, Black Lives Matter, systemic racism, queer theory, intersectionality. I mean, all these different terms and all these different ideas are just at the forefront of all the news and a whole bunch of discussion. And what I think is important for us to understand is that these are all sort of the bits and pieces, as Francis Schaeffer talks about, of an underlying worldview. Okay, so Schaeffer, and I made mention of this quote either a couple weeks ago or so, where he says that whenever you have a worldview, there is an inevitable outworking of that worldview into our culture through its ideas. And so these ideas that we're talking about, like white privilege and cancel culture and racism and so on and so forth, these are the bits and pieces of the worldview, but they're all grounded in the underlying worldview. And so this might explain why perhaps you've been in a conversation with someone who differs from you about these ideas, about white privilege or about racism or about Black Lives Matter, and you found yourself not getting anywhere. And I believe one of the reasons is because we're addressing the symptoms or the bits and pieces of the worldview, but we're not addressing the underlying worldview. Just like if, you had an infection from something and you had symptoms of a fever and a runny nose. And so you take, Tylenol to address your fever and you take an antihistamine to address your runny nose, but those are just addressing the symptoms. you won't really get rid of the infection until you address the underlying issue. And in the same way, I think the helpful element, or one of the helpful elements of this book, is that it helps us to think of these ideas in light of their underlying worldviews, which I believe is important, so that when we're trying to address an idea or show why it's mistaken, one of the best ways to do that is to look at the underlying worldview. So I think this is one of the great things about this particular book, which is why we chose it. So anyways,
that's so good. Alan, you should just keep going.
No,
you're so smart.
I just want to help us remember kind of why we chose this book, because I think it's helpful, and I think it speaks to our current cultural situation so well. So anyways, in light of that, let's kind of unpack some definitions, because I know there's a lot of controversy about these ideas, what these ideas mean, and what they're defined as. So maybe just let's talk about Marxism proper and maybe cultural Marxism, because I know there's probably some questions about that. I don't know if either one of you guys wants to jump in with helpful understanding of or distinction between those two things.
Well, I want to hear what John has to say, but as I read the book, it seemed apparent that as far as Marxism goes, there's so many versions and kind of disagreement, whether there's like, humanist version, or there's, the version that Stalin ran with. And so there's kind of some infighting going on between Marxists on what is Marxism, right? And inevitably there's going to be the person who says, well, you're doing it wrong, and that's why. And I think it's helpful, maybe as we start, to just maybe even before we try to define what Marxism is to make a distinction. And I think Sire does this in the book, between the Marxism in theory, which I think we'll all agree there's some things there that, hey, we would get behind, right? And then what it looks like in practice. And it's just been, I mean, you can look at how it's been worked out in different countries under different regimes, and it just doesn't work. And I think, and this is what something we'll come to, is from a Christian perspective, there's a reason why it doesn't work. And we haven't had a chance to talk about this, but my suspicion is it has to do with a proper understanding of what we are, who we are as human beings. So kind of like a biblical anthropology shows that Marxism will never work in practice. So I don't know if I personally don't know what a good definition of Marxism would be. And maybe John can help us out here. But obviously it has to do with, however you slice it, has to do with economics. That's Marxism proper. And you essentially have different classes as a result of economics. And as a result, and this is where we're going to start heading towards critical theory, you end up with this divide, right? You have the people in power, they're the ones that control the resources. And then you have these other people who have maybe no property, no power, no control. And one group is using power over the other. So I don't know if, John, you want to jump in here? And
I really like everything you're saying. One of the things that comes to my mind as we're talking is I like to start with the common grounds. And I think a lot of the vision of Marx and Marxists in general, one of their core understandings of what they believe is that they want to see ultimately the good for everybody, which is just what we want as well. And kind of like a classless society, ultimately, where everybody's on a level playing field and we're all equal, which it necessarily necessary to bringing that about would be that we'd have a culture where we're less individualistic, we're more community minded, we're seeking the betterment of others as opposed to ourselves. So we're very outward focused, and this is a Christian ethic for sure. Sacrificial living. These are principles, but what's missing is like what you were getting at is a proper anthropology, but even that is grounded in a proper theology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what happens is we're trying to get rid of Marx in this instance is trying to get rid of God, but still seek a world that is as if God existed. So I was talking to Alan beforehand. It's like we want to live by the principle to love your neighbor as yourself, but want to get rid of the command giver. And when you do that, when you get rid of the command giver, you get rid of the commands.
Yeah.
So there's no reason to obey. And I think that this is one of the fundamental problems with Marx in general. A lot of what he says, I mean, when I read him, and I'm fairly new to Marxism, guys, like, so just to be upfront, I never studied real economics, and I've been introduced to Marxism, but it's been on a very popular level until fairly recently. And when I read a lot of what he was saying, a lot of it's kind of like, oh, wow, that'd be really, really nice, you know? But then, like what Alan, you started off with, is that it sounds really, really nice, but on a worldview level, it's important that we address these issues. And actually, it works to our benefit on a worldview level too, because we can find the common ground with folks who we fundamentally disagree with on a worldview level, but we can find common ground in these things, and then help them or help each other see that it's not consistent with the larger overarching principles of their worldview. And here Marx runs into some major issues. So, I mean, yeah, so as far as Marxism goes, I think it can be defined, it started out as an economic theory. It's a science, an economic theory that where we're seeking to a classless society. The term that was used in the book I really liked was where the ultimate goal is a new socialist individual, you know, where we're less individualistic, and you're working for the common good for everybody. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Alan?
Yeah, no, I that's really helpful. I like that. And you're right. I think one of the points that Sire makes is that there are many reasons why people are drawn to Marxism, because he argues that Marxism touches on a whole bunch of genuine intuitions, like, for example, the genuine need for community, like you were kind of referring to, John.
Yeah.
He's super sensitive to poverty, to the loss of dignity of the individual, when the individual is kind of seen like this, you know, cog, you know, in this large industrial machine. You know, Marx also, of course, you know, draws upon this desire, or not desire, but a repulsion towards being oppressed, you know, which again, I think is totally legitimate, right? We should be upset about that. And then, of course, he also draws upon this internal sense and need and desire for justice. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think these are all things that we intuitively desire. And of course, we would argue that we all intuitively desire those things because we're made in God's image, and they reflect the nature of God, a God who's
right.
just, a God who sees individual human beings as valuable and intrinsically worthwhile. But as you pointed out, it's, you know, he wanted to do away with religion. He wants to do away with God. So the question then becomes, how can you logically ground all these things? How can you actually ground that human beings are important and valuable, and that we should care for them and try to seek their freedom from oppression? You know, why should we pursue X, Y, and Z? You know, that he says. So all these things seem to be just thrown out the door when you pull the rug out from underneath Marxism, which is God, the grounding for all of it. So yeah, so I sense the same thing too. I mean, Sire I don't think goes all the way there with all that stuff. I mean, he touches on a lot of it, but it doesn't go that far, because it's just a short section, right? Pages, I think, 75 to 81.
Yeah,
it's like 6 pages, real quick.
And that's going to lend itself to the difficulty that we have before us today, trying to discuss Marxism in any meaningful way in a brief period of time. And Tim, you had mentioned, you know, Marxism has all these offshoots. So there's the theories in the philosophy that Marx had, right? He's a philosopher.
Yeah.
And then they were adapted and adopted by other people, right? So, I mean, you have the Marxism of a Stalin and a Lenin, and they're vastly different than some of maybe the Marxisms that we hear about even today in our current political climate, where there's this tendency now where Marxism, I would say in the probably 70s, 80s was definitely, I mean, it seemed dormant or dead, is now receiving a new life. There's a resurgence of some types of Marxism, but it's vastly different than the Marxism of Stalin. And that's legitimate. I think oftentimes, and this is part of the importance of us having this conversation and having these conversations and laying down definitions and coming to understandings, is because when somebody, oh man, what was Bernie Sanders? What was he running as?
A socialist.
A socialist. So a democratic socialist, right?
Oh yeah, right.
I mean, that is a legitimate, I'm not trying to get political, I don't want to go there, but like that is a legitimate term that means something. And it means that he doesn't line up with Lenin. And I think it's important that we're honest and in our dialogues when we start talking about these things, but there is just so much here. I mean, there's Marxism that leans towards democracy, and then there's the totalitarian Marxism of Stalin, and then there's all in between. But I think ultimately the focus needs to be on man. Pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps ultimately plays a key role.
Yeah,
which is not a Christian ethic.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. As you know, read these again, just short 4 pages or whatever it was. You get this sense that Sire describes. You know, eventually you'll create this environment, right, where you said classless society, and eventually people will work for the good of others. That's what's going to motivate people. And as soon as I read that, I pulled out my pen. It's like, what world is Marx living in? You know what I'm saying? Because that's just not how people are. And again, this goes back to a kind of a biblical, when you have a biblical anthropology, you understand that the perfect environment that Adam and Eve were in didn't go well, right? And so when you have even, and now today, fallen humanity, you have selfishness, and you have these things that are at play. I get it. Again, this goes back to in theory and then in practice. In theory, assuming that people are different than they are, this could, and I'm just going to work for the well-being of my community, and that's that. But that's how. Eventually you get someone like Stalin who says, you know what, I prefer other people working for me, and I'm going to be at the top here, and I'll make sure you guys, but those people eventually rise up because that's our sinful nature. And by the way, these people they're just like everybody else as far as I'm concerned. They are fallen, and they just kind of work that out to kind of the natural consequence there. So, I just thought it was interesting that there's this idea of creating an environment that is supposed to create this, but it's not going to last. Eventually you end up, and I think we're going to see this when we get to critical theory as we kind of transition over there. What happens when the oppressors, are out of their powers taken away, and the oppressed now are in charge? Well, and I asked Neil Shenvi about this, and it's like, well, they're going to be the oppressors for a little while too, and then you've got to, like, it's the idea is it'll all kind of even out in the end, but there will be a season where, and even the critical theorist understands this, where there will be the oppressed will eventually be the oppressor. And that's even legitimate. And we'll come back to this because your morality, you end up with almost like a moral relativism at play when you start to talk about this stuff, because the oppressed, well, they get to do things that may be immoral for the oppressor to do, but not the oppressed. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
I just did a red pen logic a couple of weeks ago on a book that tries to defend looting. Okay. And the author even seems to come right out and say that she'll call herself a Marxist. That's fine. And the idea there, she's using these kind of Marxist notions that we shouldn't have property rights are racist, this kind of thing. But the premise, I mean, smuggled in there is it's okay to take other people's stuff if they're the oppressor, right? So stealing is only immoral, you know, when Amazon does it or when, you know, big corporations do it, but not when the oppressed do it. And so you end up, and so we could talk more about that.
Yeah, I want to go back to something you said like just a few minutes ago about how Marxism kind of presupposes this view of humanity that is, well, I mean, frankly, it's unbiblical, right? So, but Sire does make mention of that, and I forgot he made mention of this, where he says, well, look, this whole idea presumes that people are good, and so when you talk about, you know, the oppressed and oppressors, you know, kind of coming, and you're assuming that this sort of level where everyone's in the same level can be achieved because it presumes people are inherently good or basically good, which of course is unbiblical, and I would argue, based on our universal experience, is also untrue. But he raises the question on page 80, the question, Tim, that you brought up. He says, is it really plausible to think that selfishness and greed are solely a product of scarcity and class division? Is it really possible to make human beings fundamentally good if we have the right environment for them? So again, because Marxism is presupposing that if you just make everything else around the individual or around people just right, because they're inherently good, they'll just do the right thing, and they'll end up in a kind of classless society where everybody's just hunky-dory. And of course, that's based on, we would argue, a faulty presumption that people are basically good, and that the only problem that's happening is, you know, kind of the systems around them. So
something that kind of addresses that, but it comes before it in the book that I thought was kind of telling is that, so when we're talking about the balancing out of, you know, oppressed versus oppressor, on page 78, right at the bottom, the last paragraph, for Marx, the revolt of the proletariat will be different from any previous revolution. And this is where I kind of highlighted some stuff, and I put CRT right next to it. In the past, one social class overthrew a rival oppressing class and became in its turn the oppressor. And that's kind of like the end goal here with critical theory. But for Marx, I think it was a little bit different. Like, anyways, the proletariat will, however, be the majority, not the minority. And then I underlined here, they have no vested interest in the old order of things, so it'll be in their own best interest to abolish the whole system of class oppression. And then right next to it, I wrote, yeah, right, exclamation point.
That's funny.
And it's a lofty goal. You know, it's a lofty goal. And ultimately, it was achieved. It already has been achieved, but it was achieved by Jesus Christ on the cross, where he abolished these systems. It doesn't come through overthrowing of rival oppressing classes. And it's just it's an interesting look into what's really propelling Marxism, and then out of Marxism, you know, the social Marxism, and then out of social Marxism, critical theory, and then all the branches out of critical theory.
Yeah, John, it's so funny. I have that same section like highlighted, circled, starred, and then to the left of it, I put really, like, question mark. I'm like, no way. Like, there's no possible way that's going to happen, right? Anyways, it's just funny that we had the same sort of like visceral response to that and be like, absolutely.
Yeah. And then all the language ultimately, if we're talking from a worldview perspective, because it's Marx who said that religion is the opiate of the masses, right? It's Marx who followed Feuerbach, who said that God is a human invention, and so God is nowhere out there. And yet I hear all these terms that he uses, the good of others, all this moral language tied throughout everything that he was writing, right? And yet he shuns off any type of existence of an objective moral reality. It's just so interesting how people can be, he's obviously really smart, right? Marx was a really smart guy, probably, but it's just glaring, the contradiction that finds its roots in his worldview of naturalism.
Right. So let's transition over to critical theory, since really kind of what we're seeing, or bits and pieces of it and elements of it and its ideas being worked out in our culture today. And so like we talked about with Marxism, we want to be careful about how we define this. And, at Standard Reason, we love to say, what do you mean by that, right? The Columbo question. So I know people have referred to critical theory as a worldview, and others say, no, it's not a worldview. It's a framework, or it's a hermeneutic. It's a way to see what's happening in society. I don't know. Does anybody either one of you guys want to throw your thoughts into that particular question, or make a distinction between critical theory and contemporary critical theory? Since critical theory.
Yeah. Well, again, I talked to Neil Shenvi about this a couple weeks ago, and he's done a ton of reading on this issue. Yeah. Like, he's just gone into the weeds. Okay. And it was he who, before we went live on our discussion, he said, Tim, just so we're clear, there is a distinction between critical theory, how it started, and what we would just describe as he called contemporary critical theory. Okay. And that's what we're seeing today. And so he didn't get into the nitty gritty on the differences. He just stated that there was a difference, mm-hmm. and that there is, debate over whether this would qualify as a worldview. It certainly, as you just described, Alan, is like a framework, or a hermeneutic. It's people are seeing the world through this thing, through these beliefs. And so it may be, and this is what Neil does, he, instead of just kind of giving you a one-off definition of the term, he breaks down using 4 premises what contemporary critical theory entails. So what I think will be helpful for us is if we answer some worldview questions, and as we answer those questions, we'll see certain key components of contemporary critical theory that will become apparent. So that might be the best way, instead of just here's a definition, because I asked him the same question, what is it? And he went back and gave me the history and from the Frankfurt School and all this other stuff, and who are the names that kind of where it all goes back to. But at the end of the day, there's these main points, okay? Mm-hmm. And so maybe we should kind of walk through those as we answer the big worldview questions.
Great idea. So just for those of you who are following along, the 4 questions we'll try to unpack are: number 1, who are we? Number 2, what is the fundamental problem for us as humans? Number 3, what is the solution to that problem? And number 4, what is our moral duty? So like Tim was saying, we want to, answer the question, what is critical theory? As we answer these questions and see how critical theory answers these questions. And then I think we'd also probably contrast it with the biblical worldview and see how that worldview answers the same question, because I think that'll help us to better understand it.
And that goes with this what we've been doing all along in this book club. It goes along with what the Universe Next Door is all about. So what they do in the book is ask worldview questions with all these different worldviews. And what we're saying is, well, contemporary critical theory isn't necessarily a worldview, but it is a way people are seeing the world through this lens. And there are worldview questions that are involved. So that's how we're going to attack this.
Yeah. And just for clarification, if we say critical theory, we mean contemporary critical theory.
Yeah.
Even though critical theory, properly speaking, is referring to the early 20th century expression of it,
Yeah.
you know, in the Frankfurt School in Germany. And then contemporary critical theory is the sort of the modern outworking that we're seeing today. So for those of you who are sticklers about definitions, just know we mean the same thing. We're just using the terms interchangeably for now.
Yeah. So
right,
how about that first question?
Yeah. Who are we?
Who are we, Alan?
So, well, let's just say biblically, who are we, right? So, of course, the Christian worldview, Christian theism, says that there is a God who has created us, and He's created us in His image. So, in other words, human beings have intrinsic value by virtue of the fact that they are created by God and made in God's image. And I would add that because we are made in God's image, that is something that every human being, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of social class, regardless of age or disability or whatever, this being made in God's image is something that we all share equally. And so therefore, that's what justifies human equality. Mm-hmm. And I would argue, at least in Western culture, that's what's largely justified human equality. You know, Martin Luther King Jr. argued for the equal treatment of blacks and whites and everybody else because he was a Baptist pastor who believed in being made in God's image, right? So,
which, by the way, Alan, you did a great job describing that. It's something we all, I think, as a culture, we take it for granted. We just assume, hey, you're human, so you have all the same values that everyone else has. But sure. When you talk about grounding this stuff, you know, it's like, well, then all of a sudden people start, and they've done this for years. You know, we all speak on abortion, and you look at the track record of history, and there's always been people that have been excluded from being given human value that we would say are human. You know, Jews were considered life unworthy of life. You have African Americans, same thing. And today we have the unborn. You know, just because you have human DNA, which every unborn child has, doesn't give you that value, right? According to the culture, you have to be born, you know, or you got to meet some property or some attribute or whatever, you know. Right. So this idea of human equality is something I think we want to share, but it's not easily grounded apart from God.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to add on one more thing, I mean, being made in God's image is not a degreed property. It's not something that you can have more of it or less of it. Like, you know, when it comes to height, you know, obviously some people are higher, taller than others, you know, or math capability, or, you know, the ability to play piano, or any physical trait, you're going to have it in degrees. But being made in God's image is something that we all have equally, which is why it grounds human equality, or why it can ground human equality.
Yeah.
Why it does. So anyways, yeah, I think that's huge. So of course, critical theory falls within the broader view, philosophy of Marxism, which of course falls within the broader worldview of naturalism. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who advocates for critical theory is an atheist, but we have to understand and acknowledge that it stems from an atheistic naturalistic worldview. And so as a consequence, you know, critical theory really doesn't say anything about how we're created. And so our identity isn't in God or being made in God's image. Rather, critical theory argues that our identity is based upon our categorization or classification in a certain group, in our group membership, especially as it pertains to whether that group that you belong to is part of an oppressor group or the oppressed group.
Yeah. Social binary.
So that's, I mean, of course, if we're not made in God's image, then yeah, there is no equality, and it makes sense that therefore they see everybody as unequal. There's inequality everywhere they look. I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and that's the social binary, you know. And also, I'd like to reiterate something that you said. Also, I don't argue that everybody who is favorable to critical theory is a Marxist either. You know, I think it's important to state that as well, because oftentimes in a conversation, this is why this is so important, that we get definitions and come to understand these and kind of shed our ignorance of these philosophies and stuff, so that we can actually have conversations with people without calling them names, or just to kind of break through the rhetoric and actually have a conversation. And while some of your friends may be proponents, like there are great pastors out there. There are pastors out there who are proponents right now of critical theory that 5 years ago I was listening to and really enjoyed their preaching. And they haven't, and I wouldn't say they've become Marxist. Maybe they're confused, or they've conflated some of their Christianity with some other non-Christian ideas, but I don't think that they're Marxist. But ultimately, it comes down to there's a social binary, and that's where we find our identity in which oppressed or oppressor group we find ourselves in, and then we're further defined by our lines of intersectionality, right? So how oppressive am I? Well, all three of us, we're pretty oppressive. Maybe you to a lesser extent, Alan, because you have Assyrian roots. But Tim, you're like of all of us, but that's how we define that. But that's how we find our identity. And this must be exhausting. Like if you ascribe to this and actually believe it, like looking through the world with a social binary lens just seems really tiring to me. Yeah.
So this might be a good, I don't know, Alan, you have a graphic that's this matrix.
Oh yeah.
And is this a good time to show that? Because I'm guessing there are some people watching and they understand, okay, social binary. So basically there's two groups, right? Binary, it's two groups. There's oppressed and there's oppressors, right? Okay. And how do I know which one? How do I know where I fit in this thing? Am I an oppressor? Am I oppressed? And I think this matrix that you found on a website helps lay down where you would land. Okay.
Yeah. So I think, so this kind of is turning into the second question then. What's the fundamental problem as humans? So
yeah,
we just answered, who are we? Well, we're basically individuals who are part of a certain group, whether we're part of the oppressed or the oppressor group. So like you said, the social binary. Now the question becomes, well, what's the fundamental problem with this? And so
can I add one thing that I think is really important in that first question, who are we? Notice that and this has Marxist roots, all semblances of individuality are stripped. So we no longer look at the person.
Yeah.
We're looking at them according to this social binary, oppressed or oppressor. It's really important, especially I can't tell you how many times recently I've been told that I'm a racist. I am not a racist. I'm not, but that's because what they do, what happens is, according to critical theories, you get lumped into one of these two groups,
right?
Regardless of who you really are inside. And that's why the gospel is so beautiful. And that's why being made in the image of God is the great equalizer.
John, that's exactly what a racist would say. They would say, I'm not a racist. Okay. So
I'm not.
Yeah, and so this is a really good point. We're going to have to come back, and I think we'll talk about race in more detail. But we got to define our terms, because terms are being changed, right? And that word racist is being used in a different way. But again, social binary means, who are we? Well, we're not equal. You got to find yourself in a group, okay? And by the way, that group is. What they look at is not John. What they're going to look at is his skin color. They're going to look at his gender. They're going to look at his, so we did his religion. These are the kinds of questions we're asking, not who is John, but what classification does he
And Tim, notice that the qualifications themselves, if we were having this conversation a year and a half ago, we'd be the same group that's in charge or stamping this movement forward is the same group that was saying that there's no such thing as gender. There's no such thing as race. You can be whoever you want. Yeah. And there's a schizophrenia running rampant in these philosophies or frameworks.
Yeah,
it's really interesting. Like, we live in a day and an age that wants to throw off gender, but yet if you're a woman, you're an oppressed people group, right? And it's just really interesting. It's just so interesting. This stuff's amazing to me.
Super good points, John. Thanks for bringing up those last 2 points. Those are excellent.
You're welcome, Alan.
Because you're bringing value to this book club that otherwise wouldn't be here if you weren't here. But I think since you said that whole thing about I'm not racist, but you would be defined as racist, we should probably just define it right now, right? Because we just mentioned it. So typically, how we've thought of racism is simply you perceiving another ethnic group as inferior to yours, right? So if you see, for example, John, you see Assyrians, my people, as inferior to yours, right? And you would say, no, Alan, I'm not a racist in that sense. You know, I don't see African Americans as less valuable than me, or Assyrians, or whoever. Okay, but you'll still be labeled as a racist from the perspective of a advocate of critical theory, because you belong to a group. As you said, people don't see you as an individual, but rather as belonging to a group of white, male, Christian, whatevers. And so therefore, since that group is the group has the power in our culture, therefore you are racist by virtue of your belonging to that group, even though you might say individually, no, I'm not racist. I have no racist attitudes towards anybody. So that's the challenge. That's why people often are talking past each other.
Yeah.
So we should go to the next question. What is the fundamental problem as humans? And Tim, you're referring to this graphic. So whoops, that's the wrong graphic. Here it is. Yeah, so I took this from a website that's an advocate of critical theory, and they have this thing called the oppression matrix. And actually, I don't like the way they've organized the columns. So I start with the right-hand column first, which is the column that says social identity category. And so these are the categories by which people belong to: certain races, certain sexes, gender, sexual orientation, class, ability or disability, religion, age. And I would also add where you're born, right? Are you, for example, for those of us who live in the United States, are we Native American, not Native American, but are we born in the United States, or are we born in a different country like India or Zimbabwe or whatever? So that's the category. But as we were talking about, and that identifies who we are, which is the first question. The fundamental problem is that there's a social binary. You are either part of column 2, the privileged social group, which is the oppressor group, or in column 4, you're part of the oppressed social group. Okay, so let's take race, as they say it, social identity. So John, you're in the privileged social group of a white person. So you are part of the oppressor group, and just by definition, whether you actually are racist or not, or whether you think you're racist or not, you are according to this definition. And so the oppressed social group would be Asians, Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, so on and so forth, right? Or Canada, First Nations, New Zealand, the Maori, or whatever. You get the point. So yeah, that's a social binary. And so along the category of race, the very first column says the type of oppression. John, you're engaging in a type of racism by virtue of you belonging to the white people and there being the oppressed people that are elsewhere in our culture. And so they can go to sex. Okay, John, you're also a male, from what you told me last time. And notice the privileged social group you belong to is biological males, right? Well, biological women are the oppressed social group, so you're also a sexist, right? So that's where sexism comes in.
I don't like where this is going.
I do.
I do too.
Gender, you're gender conforming. You're cisgender, right? Mm-hmm. And you're heterosexual, and you're rich, aren't you? Aren't you a millionaire?
According to the world standards, for sure.
You're upper class, for sure. You're able-bodied, except for your hair.
Yeah, why is baldness on here?
Well, yeah. That's part of being able to know. Anyways, so yeah, so this oppression matrix to me is really helpful because I can kind of see at a glance all the categories by which critical theory operates and lumps people in, and who the in the social binary, the oppressor group and the oppressed group, and the type of oppression that's happening.
Yeah.
And it might be helpful to talk here about intersectionality, right? Because when you see this matrix, it's really helpful, because the idea of intersectionality is to say, well, where do what? Because some people are going to, I mean, John is basically at the top, right? As the most oppressive you can get. I think he checked every box in that privileged social group, right?
Yeah.
But there are going to be some people who don't check every box. They may be white and heterosexual, able-bodied, but it might be a female, it might be a woman. And so where they line up, their intersection in this matrix is going to be different, right?
Right.
And so you can see how you could just, depending on the person's identity categories, how they answer the questions, they're going to be at a different location. And that's going to determine just how oppressed you are, or just how much of an oppressor you are, right?
Yeah, it's exactly
right. I mean, notice a few things. The things that stand out to me is this system seems inherently racist. This system of thought itself is racist, because that's the primary quality of a human being that they're using to define who I am. And not only that, but like, so part of racism, I would say, is like the belief that that your race, one's race, is the primary determination of value or worth, or that you're more superior over somebody if you're a different race or not. And that's exactly what this system is doing. It's asserting itself on top of me because I'm white. And then my other thing that's going through my mind right now, that's like, this stuff is just so much to talk about. I wish that we had more time. I guess we have more time. We could do whatever we want. But welcome to the 4-hour book club.
Yeah.
But what happens when you move this? I want to know what happens when you move this chart here over on top of Egypt. Then what? Where there aren't as many white people.
Well, yeah. I mean, this I think goes to some of the self-refuting nature of critical theory, because this idea that you're part of an oppressor group, it's context dependent, right? A trait that would give you, say, power in one setting might be the basis for your oppression in another setting. So, a white Christian in the United States is part of the privileged social group, but a white Christian in Egypt, well, you're definitely part of the oppressed social group right there. There's 90 million people in Egypt, and only like 10 million of them are Christians. A lot of them, most of them are perhaps Coptic Christians.
Alan, do you know the population of every country on the earth?
No, I don't know. I just happen to know that one. But anyway, I don't even know if I'm right. I'm just guessing it's around 90 million. I could be. It's more than Canada, which is not saying much.
Yeah. Did you guys see Andrew's comment as well? I don't know if you were done there, Alan. I thought this was really
me off as a oppressor, but whatever.
This is a really good point. He says this ultimately dilutes the meaning of oppression, and also makes guilt impersonal. And I had thought about the first part. The second part, that's a really good point.
Really good.
Because now I'm guilty just for being in that group, right? I'm white, male. So you go down the list, and I have to, I'm a racist, sexist, heterosexist, classist, go down the list.
Right.
But that makes it, that's more like there's group guilt. If you're in that group, you're guilty.
Right.
But what about personal guilt? What about the guy who mistreats someone because of their sex or their gender or whatever, or prejudges someone because of those things? Well, they should feel shame and guilt for that. And so now it's like it almost trivializes real shame and real guilt and real oppression, because there was never any oppression done
by the individual,
by no act that you can point to. You're pointing to just these identity categories. You're not pointing to some specific behavior, right?
Well, it'd be white silence, right? White silence is violence. So it's like, you're right. There is group guilt, but then if you're not the one who's also involved in the activism and the social justice work and in calling this out, then that would perhaps be the personal guilt.
Yeah,
that would be.
There's no opportunity for reconciliation. If you don't have a personal guilt, what are you reconciling? Because all you're going to be doing is you're going to be ultimately, in an ultimate sense, you're dismissing your guilt. So you don't really feel any shame or guilt because you haven't done anything wrong. So it's just my people, right? It's just whiteness is the problem. Well, how do we fix this? Like because true reconciliation, true repentance comes at a cost of something. And when it's a broad thing, like what we're talking about, an impersonal guilt towards a people group, there's no real reconciliation.
Right.
No?
Yeah. It's Charlie was just asking this question in critical theories.
Great minds, Charlie.
I know. We should have had him speaking on behalf of you, John.
That'd be way better.
Anyways, thanks for that thought, John. Yeah. So, and thanks, Andrew. That was a great point. So obviously the flip side of critical theory's assessment of the fundamental problem is, we would argue, is the biblical identification of the problem, which is sin, right? Which is personal, that we are guilty for our sin. And anyway, so that then, we don't have to go into that because that's the Christian worldview, which hopefully most of us know. We can then turn to the third question. Yeah, I guess based on some of the research being done these days about like the divinity of Christ and how many Christians think Christ is.
Oh, I don't want to talk about that. It makes me sad.
Sorry.
Now I'm sad.
Yeah, we don't get sad either. Okay, so the third question is, what is the solution to this problem that critical theory suggests, right? The social binary, the oppression. What's the solution? Obviously, if the problem was sin, it would be reconciliation, like you, John, and Charlie were talking about just a minute, right? The relationship that's been fractured is your relationship with God, and the solution would be reconciliation, going from a position of being an enemy of God to being at peace with God. But since that's not the problem in critical theory, the problem is the oppressive nature of various groups, the solution is going to be different. And it's going to be liberation from all forms of human oppression, right?
Yeah. And how you do that is, well, a couple things. There's social justice, activism, that kind of thing. But there's something here that we should talk about, and that's lived experience, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what we mean by lived experience is you eliminate social oppression by talking to people who have been oppressed, and getting their story and listening. And this is where, and it's just interesting because there may be some who have lived experience that it's just anecdotal. It's just something that they experienced. And then we call that, well, then there must be racism everywhere or something like that. You know what I'm talking about? So there's an instance.
The individual is generalized.
Yeah, because, well, instead of appealing to data, to facts, to studies, we appeal to the individual, and whatever they experienced is true. And as the oppressor, as someone who is in the group of oppressor, you just listen and accept it as truth, right? You can't even challenge the lived experience because it's an experience that they believe is true, right? And maybe it is. But so there's kind of a smuggled in different view of truth. I don't know if we call it relativism, because certainly they believe oppression is bad so so that appeals to some kind of objective morality standard, but at the same time, here you have this idea that the individual goes through this experience, and that's true.
Yeah. So I was going to say this. This kind of goes back to the whole intersectionality point, right? Because if you think about that matrix and you can check off being, a lesbian, a woman, disabled, and a Muslim, well, I don't know, you know what I mean. So you have greater intersectionality. Well, then your lived experience, you have greater moral authority to speak about your lived experience, and your lived experience has greater weight.
Yeah.
And indeed, the oppressor groups, like you, John, you have an illusory perception about reality, right? And so for you to deny that this is all happening is proof of the fact that you just have an illusion, that you're not seeing reality for what it is, So this is really actually an epistemological challenge. I mean, they, like you're saying, Tim, it's kind of like relativism. Like they're just saying, well, we can get, who has the moral authority to speak to these matters? People who are the oppressed, who have this lived experience. But that presumes like we can't then go to reason and facts and logic and so on and so forth as providing, like you said, evidence for whether these things whether the theses are actually true or not.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's an epistemological challenge.
Yeah.
This is all
part of epistemology. Sorry, I just mean how we come to know something, how we come to know whether something is true or not. That's epistemology. And so on critical theory, it's based on the lived experience of oppressed people. But we would say in reality, it's based on, do we have good reason to think this is true? What is the evidence for it? What are the arguments for it? But lived experience just trumps all of that.
Yeah. This is all part of, Abdu Murray talks about in his book on truth.
Saving Truth?
Is it Saving Truth? Or is that Nancy Pearcey's?
Oh, no, hers is total truth. His is just part of the truth. We're just talking about saving. Hers is totally complete. No, I think it is.
Abdu does a great.
Abdu, can't remember the name.
Abdu Murray does a great job in his book of pointing out that we live in a post-truth culture. So it's not even any longer post-modernism, where it's great book. And in the post-truth culture, feelings and experiences trump facts and statistics. And I think that there's when we're talking about sharing experience and stuff like this, when we come in this part of the discussion with critical theory, something actually resonates with me because maybe because I'm a pastor kind of at heart, and I like hearing people's stories, and I think God gives us our stories for a reason. So in reading and researching and just trying to figure out what's going on with critical theory, I've spoken to a lot of people I disagree with to hear their stories. And my view of this issue has been changed by that. So I think that there's value in us sitting down with people who we disagree with on this issue and actually hearing their story.
Yeah. Now,
I think the issue, the where we don't want to go is that, well, because you experienced X, Y, or Z, therefore it's applicable to everything on top of all of reality, right?
Yeah.
But I remember having dinner one night with a black pastor friend of mine, and I was the only white guy at the table. And it was right around the time Trayvon Martin was shot and died. And I remember looking at that news story, and I hope I don't get myself in trouble here, but I probably will. I remember looking at that news story whenever it happened, thinking it was pretty clear cut, like kind of what happened. It was super sad, but it was kind of clear cut. It seemed to me like the facts. And when I had mentioned that around the dinner table with my friends, they were astonished that I didn't see this event, just screaming racism. And there's something there. There's something going on there. There's something going on because these people who have very similar lived experiences as me, a couple of them were Pepperdine students. I mean, it's not like they're from the same place that I'm from ultimately, but they see this one event very differently than me. And what clicked at that moment is that there's a difference between empathizing with somebody, hearing somebody's story and coming alongside them relationally and feeling genuine empathy for them. I'm so sorry that you feel this way, and agreement.
Yeah.
I don't have to agree with what you're saying, but I can at least come alongside you and say, you know what, like, I don't understand how this affects you, but it's obviously affecting you in a real way. And I'm really sorry for that. And I'm trying, what I found is I'm trying to separate those two with my discussions with friends. Anytime I hear, for example, of a black man being shot by the police, my mind doesn't always go racism, but the mind of some of my black friends does. So I can reach out to my core friends who might see this event as something personal, something that I don't really understand. And I can say, hey, you know, I saw the news this morning, man, and I'm here with you. I just prayed for you or whatnot. And then hopefully at a later date, we can talk about these underlying principles. But anyways, I just wanted to add that.
And we're not trying to downplay the power of testimony or stories. In fact, there's a great book called Just Mercy that just outlines story after story of injustice, racial injustice. And it's powerful. It moves you to tears to know some of the things that happened, real acts of racism. And so we're not trying to say that that's not, but what we are saying is there's a certain standard of truth, going back to what Alan said about epistemology. How do we know something? And when people are making claims of systemic racism and these kinds of things, we're looking and we're asking for the evidence. We're looking for something, you know, we're looking for the evidence, right? And want to follow that wherever it leads. So maybe we should move on to the next point. We're getting close to the hour.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've kind of already touched on it. The question is, what is our moral duty? And
Social
I think,
justice.
What's that?
Social justice.
Yeah. Activism, social justice. Yeah, that's right. So Tim, you kind of I think you mentioned it already. Is there some, I don't know if that's already obvious enough, or do we need to explain that some more? I'm only asking because we're close to when we said we were going to end. But
Yeah.
said we don't necessarily have to end, but again, we don't want to draw it out too long.
Yeah, I just mentioned social justice as a way to alleviate oppression, right? That's if your problem is oppression, then social justice is going to be the way that you do it on this view, right? And that's done through activism. And that's why, trying to understand movements like Black Lives Matter and just go down the list of different things that have happened in the culture recently, you can see that this follows with this worldview, right? They're trying to answer the problem with the solution, and the solution entails them to be a moral duty that's put on their lives. And so that causes them to march in the streets. For some people, that's causing them to behave violently and riot and all this other stuff. If you go down deep, some of these guys are just thugs, whatever. Others think it's their moral duty to go out there and destroy someone's business. You know what I'm saying? And so again, we should try to understand where they're coming from. We can believe that it's totally wrong what they're doing, but let's try to understand the worldview that's in play here.
Yeah, that's a hugely important point, Tim. And that's, like we said, the basis for why we're, doing a book on worldviews, because when you understand the worldviews, as Schaeffer says, they bring about with inevitable certainty these ideas that are then played out in culture. And that's like what Tim's saying is what we're seeing. So this is why it's so critical to understand this. And I recently wrote an article about how do we prepare for the next cultural revolution. And so I kind of talk about how, look, in 10 years, we probably won't be dealing with what we're dealing with today, or 5 years for that matter. I don't know. But in 5 or 10 years, there's going to be something else, another idea that's going to be playing itself out in our culture. Mm-hmm. And perhaps in a more dramatic way, perhaps less. I don't know. I don't even know what that idea is going to be. But by studying worldviews and understanding and categorizing ideas by worldviews, we can see these ideas as they begin to creep up and either nip them in the bud or address them or whatever, before they become a big problem. And I would argue, I think what's probably bothered a lot of us, in terms of, John, Tim, and I, is that we understand that people who aren't Christians would adopt critical theory and just be like, yeah, this makes perfect sense because they don't adopt our worldview. But it's super frustrating when Christians adopt it because we believe it's a worldview that's hostile. It's not just unbiblical, it's anti-biblical. It's contra-biblical. It's hostile to the Christian worldview. And so by teaching people worldviews and for believers to understand worldviews, it helps to inoculate them to these ideas so they don't succumb to them later on in the future.
But also we should say that coming to understand this, we also come to understand that Christianity gives a far superior answer. And it's like these things ultimately, in my mind, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but in my mind, these are responses to actual issues out in the culture. And I think the church has failed in many regards to actually address some of these issues at first. Like, there'd be no need, I think, if the church was really being the church, and this is like a whole nother discussion, I guess, but if the church was actually being the church, I'm not sure that there'd be a need for like a Black Lives Matter or anything like this. I think that we would be offering an attractive solution to this problem, and in the process, many souls would be won to Christ. So that's really why this is really, really important to understand. We got to understand the other side and what's going on in the culture so that we can flood it, in my opinion, with the Christian worldview and show not only are you wrong, but I got something way better for you. And his name is Jesus.
That's a beautiful ending.
Yeah.
You should close us out every week. That's beautiful. All right. So yeah, that's a good way to perhaps end our time since we're a little bit over time. Next time that we are meeting will be October 22nd, which is in 2 weeks. Same time, 1:00 p.m. Pacific time. And so we're going to be covering 2 chapters next time. Chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5 is on nihilism, and chapter 6 is on existentialism. So because there's some relationships and ties with them, we're going to try to hit them both. It's kind of an audacious goal. But anyways, we'll address nihilism and existentialism next time in 2 weeks, week 4. So yeah.
And next week, if people are interested, guys, I'll be on with Tim Stratton talking about critical theory.
Oh, yes.
Wednesday at 1 p.m. No, noon Pacific time.
Yeah,
so
check
my time.
Yeah, and you can check our Stand to Reason Facebook page for that. Also, Tim mentioned that he interviewed Neil Shenvi, who studied critical theory like crazy. And you did a thing on how to communicate critical theory to young believers. Is that right, Tim? That was the topic?
Yeah, we're supposed to be helping, your kids. And near the end, we get to some of that stuff. But man, we were in the weeds for the first half, probably. Okay. So just brace. People need to be ready for that, to understand, deep dive, critical theory, where it's come from. But we do spend the last 15 minutes or so getting practical with tips for parents.
I thought it was really helpful and good. So I actually watched it. So.
Sweet.
You did such a good job, Tim.
Thanks.
You're so good.
That's awesome. All right. Thank you for joining us, folks. We'll see you in 2 weeks, or for those of you who are going to see John within the week with the interview
Wednesday
with Tim Stratton. Yep. All right.
See ya.
See ya. Bye.